a massive and significant attack from the ECB against Bitcoin and the strategic attempt to establish a Bitcoin reserve strategy in Germany with significant influence. And here, too, a massive attack against Christian Lindner, who supports the whole thing. To be a bit more specific, the attack comes from ECB employee and longtime Bitcoin critic Jürgen Schaaf, who confirms that Bitcoin is a bubble, Bitcoin has no value, and one should not try to use Bitcoin to build a strategic Bitcoin reserve here for Germany. This whole thing is a ridiculous endeavor, and they use mathematical formulas to show why it's nonsense. They're somehow trying to calculate why Bitcoin has no value, why it's worthless, and why it's just a silly project that's too risky, blah, 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 and so on. He even says that a strategic Bitcoin reserve contradicts all logic and the ordoliberal values. Somehow someone is actually trying to explain why Bitcoin has no value, is worthless, is simply a foolish project, is too risky, blah, 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 and so on.
He even says that a strategic Bitcoin reserve contradicts all logic and ordoliberal values. So these are really massive accusations. He is really on Peter Schiff's level here, who also assumes that a strategic Bitcoin reserve will lead to an infinitely large bubble, which will then end in a massive crash.
We are looking at the whole attack because it really leaves me speechless how someone can come up with such rubbish and get people so worked up. On the other hand, people here are constantly being expropriated through the euro, through fiat currencies. They're not offering people any alternatives here. So at the very least, they could say, hey folks, we're not exactly stable with the euro, but check out alternatives like Bitcoin, look into options like gold, or even something like a 70-30 ETF, portfolio or something like that. Even something like that, but no, that's not recommended. Instead, it's clearly stated that Bitcoin is too speculative, you can never get into it, it's too risky, blah, blah, blah. Honestly, yeah, it really leaves you speechless. And above all, this isn't the first time. ECB warns Bitcoin may become irrelevant, but could cause unrest. Schaaf confirms new criticisms. Then we saw the second article claiming that Bitcoin will lead to social unrest because early investors can finance lembos through later investors as prices skyrocket. The ECB has also confirmed that Bitcoin will likely rise even further. And now the ECB is in a state of panic, and Jürgen Schaaf is confirming the massive new criticism of Bitcoin that we're going to take a look at. And he says, read this through. This is a report from Rudy Bachman, 2021, where he says, I want to try to explain the bubble and Bitcoin in more detail. Then he starts a thread and says, I'm going to make some simplifications, for example, that no global risks arise and there are no uncertainties, blah, blah, blah. He's just talking a lot of nonsense, to be honest. Now he's making this super long thread, so let's take a look at the key points. But it's really important that this is being shared by the ECB, like from their employees. Now they're making this super long thread, so let's take a look at the key points. But it's really important that something like this is shared by the ECB, like from their employees. One must also honestly say that one has to make a distinction here between the ECB and ECB employees. I don't know if this is the ECB's position, but if you look at all the articles, you can almost assume that this is the official position. Christine Lagarde always dodges questions when she's confronted with Bitcoin. She just sidesteps them every time. And he says here, read this carefully, the ECB employees are pushing massive anti-Bitcoin campaigns and anti-Bitcoin conspiracy theories. You can already see it down in the comments. If you read the comments, for example, Glock writes here, how can one be so blinded, Samuel Kuhlman? And now we as holders of euros are supposed to continue to allow ourselves to be expropriated. So these are all very, very legitimate questions and concerns. If we look at the like-to-comment ratio, we can clearly and evidently see that this tweet has almost no likes, but rather a lot of comments because people here are massively worried and massively disagree with this ECB policy. In the end, they're desperately trying to calculate or figure out or argue, somehow using some logical conclusions that aren't even logical. Why Bitcoin, as we can see here, has no fundamental value. And then they also make simplified assumptions, like, for example, that there are just no global risks, whatever, and so on. And then they also make simplified assumptions, like, for example, that there are just no global risks, whatever, and so on. So there are just some things you can't do. That's always the mistake in science, that you just, for example, you conduct an experiment and just eliminate all external factors. Yes, you can do that, but the thing is simple. There are theories, there is practice, and in theory, some professors like Rudy Bachman here come up with some pseudoscientific calculations. And then he figures out that, yes, in the theoretical world, in my scientific economic world, Bitcoin has no value. And I'm going to break it down for you right now. And academically, I've summarized it in 100 books, and in the end, it all comes down to the fact that it has no fundamental value. The whole problem is that, in practice, it just doesn't work that way. In practice, Bitcoin has value. A whole lot of people are using Bitcoin, a whole lot of people want to have Bitcoin, like BlackRock, Larry Fink, and so on. That means that here comes Rudy Bachman, who suddenly thinks he is as smart as Michael Saylor, as smart as Larry Fink, as smart as Donald Trump, as smarter than all the German parties that are now opening up to Bitcoin. He is smarter than me. He is smarter than all of you who have subscribed to the YouTube channel. Feel free to subscribe here too. That such arguments here that people really understand that this is gaslighting, that something like this is supported by the ECB, and at the same time such nonsense arguments are being thrown out. This is really crazy. Here, Volcker writes, standard practice for pseudoscientific economics. Make simplified assumptions. Do some mathematical gymnastics until you get the desired result, and never wonder why reality always turns out differently than your calculations. The highlight was this formula. So he says here, this has to apply to the Bitcoin price today. The highlight was this formula. So he says here, this has to apply to the Bitcoin price today. Now he throws in a formula like this. Peta equals beta times peta plus 1, whatever. What he means by that, I don't even get it. I'm sorry, I only have a street diploma, my bad. That means I can't really keep up with these 2001 academic folks, but I don't have to, because I'm not blinded or brainwashed by state propaganda or any of these MMT theories. I can just think clearly, just like a kid. Every child understands that voluntariness is better than coercion. Every child understands that something scarce is better than something that expands endlessly. And this, let's say, natural form of intelligence that 2001 also allows you to understand Bitcoin. But when you start getting all academic and messing around with really complicated formulas, you suddenly begin to lose sight of Bitcoin. It's like you get trapped in your own thought construct, in your pseudoscientific framework, and completely lose touch with reality. Such people really need to go out on the street, run barefoot somewhere in the forest. They need a bit of grounding and really need to be brought down from their ivory tower. In the end, it's super simple. Bitcoin has the perfect conditions for storing value. Over time, it will absorb the monetary premium of all assets. In the end, one Bitcoin will represent 1/21 millionth of the planet's ownership. That will never be expanded. In the end, one Bitcoin represents 1/21 millionth of the planet's ownership. That will never be expanded. And any growth in planetary wealth benefits the owner of Bitcoin. That means when we have technological progress, 2001, the price of Bitcoin, when we price it in any fiat currency, will keep rising. And even if we no longer have any fiat currency and only have Bitcoin, that technological progress will simply be reflected in the purchasing power of Bitcoin. In the end, that's the very simple logical conclusion about Bitcoin. And even if we no longer have fiat currency and only Bitcoin, this technological progress will simply be reflected in the purchasing power of Bitcoin. This is ultimately the simple, logical conclusion here of Bitcoin. You don't need to pull out any rocket science formulas or anything like that. You just need to think clearly. And now it's getting really crazy because in this thread, Rudy Bachman is going to talk about why you should get out of Bitcoin, like selling your Bitcoin. It says here, but then the question arises, why invest in Bitcoin when you can get the growth rate of the economy as a return by holding other assets? Stocks do that to some extent. I'm also leaving out a lot of irrelevant details for the sake of the argument. So he's saying that in the end, with stocks, there's just this connection to the real world because they somehow produce cash flow or something like that. At least that's how I understand it. And it would be really bad if there's no cash flow with Bitcoin and if there's basically no value creation behind it. But he just doesn't get that Bitcoin is a commodity, kind of like digital gold. And it would be really bad if there's no cash flow with Bitcoin and if there's basically no value creation behind it. But he just doesn't get that Bitcoin is a commodity, kind of like digital gold. And then you'd have to say, okay, then you should sell all the gold too, because then commodities wouldn't have any justification either. That's basically a ridiculous argument. He also says that by then all Bitcoin brothers, they would want to shift their portfolios. So if people would realize or understand that their Bitcoin is basically worthless or something like that. But if they do that on day X, why should investors hold onto Bitcoin before that day? Because the only reason it has any value is that you can sell it for a higher price. But if they do that on day X, why should investors hold Bitcoin before that day? Because the thing only has value because you can sell it for a higher price. So that's the classic Maurice Hofton argument, the greater fool theory, which suggests that Bitcoin only has value because other people will buy it for even more money. I mean, in a way, the greater fool theory applies to everything in the world, even to stocks, Apple, and so on. But a lot of people don't actually want to sell Bitcoin because they've understood the fundamentals I mentioned earlier. They realize that Bitcoin is something you have to see in practice, not just in some abstract formulations or formulas. He even says that Bitcoin pros get tangled up in a mathematical contradiction, or rather, their entire return comes from the fact that you keep finding people who still believe that the value can grow faster than the economy. But like I said, that's impossible. Their entire return comes from the fact that you can always find people who still believe that the value can grow faster than the economy. But like I said, that's impossible. So I'm not denying that individual investors can get very, very rich with Bitcoin, but it's not going to last forever. And yeah, I'm not saying that everyone can get rich with Bitcoin. It's not really about getting rich with Bitcoin, but rather not becoming poor because of it. He also goes into the creative theory again, which, as I said, is nonsense. With Bitcoin, we still have monetary premium shifting from real estate, bonds, and stocks to Bitcoin due to its superior properties. People are increasingly selling stocks, bonds, and property for Bitcoin. This monetization phase sees returns of 40%, 50%, even 100% annually. More and more people are saying, hey, I'm selling my stocks, I'm selling my bonds, I'm selling my property, and putting that into Bitcoin. So this is the monetization phase where we're seeing massive returns like 40% a year, 50%, even 100% a year in some cases. And eventually, these massive returns will start to taper off because more and more of the monetary premium will have been siphoned off. And what happens then isn't like the HIO says, that Bitcoin just stops rising. Sure, you won't get rich with Bitcoin anymore, and honestly, some people aren't even getting rich now. It really depends on how you define it and how much money you're putting into Bitcoin. But returns will decrease from 50 to 60% to 10 to 12%, reflecting economic growth, possibly even 5 to 6%. So that means it'll somehow reflect economic growth, and it could even be less than that eventually, maybe only 5 or 6% or something like that. Michael Saylor says the S, at 500 plus a few percent, that will eventually be the standard rate at which Bitcoin will continue to grow, provided you have a certain level of economic productivity. That also depends on how economically advanced you are, how fast humanity is growing, and so on, as well as the demographics. There are a ton of factors, but in a world that, let's say, keeps growing, that's technologically advancing, that's creative, vibrant, and so on, Bitcoin gains will keep rising. And if there are no more fiat currencies, then there will be purchasing power. That means your Bitcoin will still be able to buy more goods because economic productivity is reflected in Bitcoin. Now, Bitcoin is not suitable as an object of obvious investment because in case of doubt, such an obvious investment, subsidized by government money, only supports the bubble and shifts it. So he's making the argument that if the FDP really goes all in on Bitcoin and builds up a strategic Bitcoin reserve, it's just going to massively inflate the Bitcoin bubble. That means he's really on Peter Schiff's level here, because Peter Schiff also says that if the US buys Bitcoin, they'll have to keep printing more money to prevent the bubble from bursting. The same goes for MicroStrategy. That means he is now making the same mistake as Peter Schiff, who is doing it with the USA and who is also doing it with MicroStrategy. And now he even says and warns that how the FDP can propose this to Christian Lindner is actually unbelievable. It contradicts, as I'm trying to show, any logic and especially the fundamental ordoliberal principles that the FDP is supposed to be committed to according to its tradition. So that's absolute bullshit. If the FDP is supposed to be a liberal party or a libertarian party, or whatever you want to call it, a freedom-oriented party, then we need free money too. You can't be a freedom-oriented party and rely on coercive money, so to speak. Money that's based on theft, money that really robs people of their last penny, and it all happens invisibly. In 2021, we really have entrenched inflation in the euro, and you can't support that as a freedom-oriented party. So Rudy Bachman might really be missing the point here. Frank Schaeffler, the FDP politician, also commented on this. He says here that the ECB holds gold reserves worth 41 billion euros, while the Bundesbank has 271 billion euros. Why, he asks. He says here that the ECB holds gold reserves worth 41 billion euros, while the Bundesbank has 271 billion euros. He asks here, gold is insurance, Bitcoin is digital gold. That's his answer here. So if gold is held in the ECB and the Bundesbank, then Bitcoin can also be held in the Bundesbank. And that's a very, very accurate and important statement here because he's going to be taken apart really easily. And then feel free to check out the comments down below. I'm really putting the thread in for you. Really, I don't know if you should take something like this seriously, whether it's satire. Feel free to let me know what you think about it. Well, I really can't take this seriously anymore. Legitimate criticisms exist, but these arguments are baseless, acting like know-it-alls lecturing Bitcoin. It's just unimaginable to me. Those are really legitimate points of criticism, but this is just pulled out of thin air. And they think they're some kind of know-it-all who has found the Holy Grail and now has to lecture the entire Bitcoin community. It's just unimaginable to me. But hey folks, this whole situation is also a great buying opportunity. It's just unimaginable to me. But hey folks, this whole situation is also a great buying opportunity. I'll put a link to 21 Bitcoin 2001 below. Here, you can use the code Bitcoin Hotel when buying Bitcoin to get up to 20% off the fees for purchasing Bitcoin. So historically, it was always very, very good to use the ECB's attacks to time the whole thing to buy Bitcoin here. In the end, everyone gets the price they deserve. And Rudy Bachman, well, he'll just jump in at 10 million and one. See you later. Peace out.